Hello everyone and welcome to my channel. Today you're in for a new video in which we will discuss the role and importance of fairy tales in Billy Wilder's work. As always, if you're new to this channel, my name is Medium, and in here we aim to discuss and discover a lot more about classic films. It's a topic that I really love, and this is a video or a topic that I've been meaning to do for a very long time. I've been thinking about writing a post for a very long time about it, and it is so fascinating, the role in general of fairy tales in our culture is fascinating in every facet. But I've always been a fan of Billy Wilder's work, not only as a filmmaker but also as a writer, as a screenwriter, and I've been again fascinated by the way he worked. Thus, in this video we're going to discuss 4 popular fairy tales, the impact that they had in Billy Wilder's work, the way he approached them, and he gave a spin to the story, much to our delight. Although Billy Wilder's work is vast and full of gems in different genres, we are going to focus today specifically on romantic comedies, which have been the most evident excuse for him to use fairy tales. In any case, this is an invitation to explore Billy Wilder's work from another perspective, and as such, I really hope that you enjoyed this video. So without any further ado, let's jump into it. I believe that Billy Wilder had a particular interest in human experience. You see, identity, the roles, what defines us, what determines our identity. Is it what we do in life? Is it the amount of money that we have? Is it the role that we have, the gender? What defines us? What really determines our identity and our existence? And I think that's a very important issue in many Billy Wilder movies. And again, I think that through fairy tales and its archetypes and its themes, he found a way to talk about all this in such a fashion that the audience would engage and understand, because fairy tales, again, they're so popular, so universally known, that they would be so easy to recognize by audiences, and therefore he could be humorous about it and deal with all these questions in a very intelligent and funny and entertaining way. And I think that's the reason why so many fairy tales are present in one form or another in his movies, in his scripts. And the first one that we will discuss is Bluebeard, and in this case in Billy Wilder's work is a direct allusion to a script that he wrote with Charles Brackett for Ernst Lubitsch, Bluebeard, a Wife, released in 1938. This fairy tale, the story of Bluebeard, is the creation of French writer Charles Perrault. It is important to know that these stories were not meant for children as they come up to be the tradition. In fact, these stories were created in French salons and were pretty much intended for adult readers, for the nobility. And I think that this one, that Bluebeard, is a clear representation or example of that, because the original story is quite gruesome. In all its forms, Bluebeard's tale is about a man who marries young women and murders them, and there's always a final girl who either arranges her own rescue or saves her from this fatal destiny. And in this case, the fairy tale is an excuse to create a screwball comedy, a battle of sexes, full of double meanings, daffy characters, and also the Lubitsch touch. And in this case, the roles are played by Gary Cooper and Claudette Colbert, and also there's Edward Everett Horton, who plays Colbert's father, who's always brilliant, always great. I forgot to mention too that David Niven is also in the film. He's very funny, although he has a minor character, I would say. And in this case, the character of Gary Cooper comes across from the beginning as a very arrogant man who is so wealthy and so careless that he has been marrying and divorcing women for years. In fact, he's been married 7 times before, thus The Eighth Wife, and it was the first time that Billy Wilder collaborated with Charles Brackett and with Ernst Lubitsch, a director that he absolutely revered. He was his personal hero, who had also been born in Europe and then emigrated to America, much like Wilder. In this case, as per usual in Billy Wilder's movies, the gender roles are often played around and made fun of, and in this case it's both male and female, the ones that attack each other and drive each other crazy, drive each other to the verge of insanity, and treat it again all with such elegance and such wit. Definitely a brilliant example for this video of the use of fairy tales in Billy Wilder's work. Now on to the next fairy tale. We will talk about Snow White, first published in the 19th century by Brothers Grimm in Germany and widely popularized by the Disney's adaptation 1937's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And in this case we're going to talk about the impact that it had in a film called Ball of Fire, with the script written by Billy Wilder, Charles Brackett, and Thomas Monroe, from a short story from Wilder while he still was in Europe, and directed by Howard Hawks in 1941. And it starred Gary Cooper again, Barbara Stanwyck, and a plethora of character actors like Oscar Homolka, Henry Travers, who plays Clarence in It's a Wonderful Life, and Richard Haydn, who I always say is a strange case of aging backwards because he looks older here than later on in the 60s when he plays Uncle Max in The Sound of Music. And we also have two favorites for me, Dan Duryea, I think that's the right pronunciation, and Dana Andrews, who play the bad guys here.
Some whistle snort in New Jersey, ran coke as it's called. How you been, Shuggy? I hear you're hiding out with the Seven Dwarfs.
8, and it's kind of indicated I better get out of here quick.
And with the most outrageous names ever, Duke Pastrami and Joe Lilac. Duke Pastrami. And the movie also has, from a personal point of view, one of the most brilliant musical numbers not within a musical movie, and that is the drum boogie that Barbara Stanwyck sings, and then the encore with Gene Krupa playing the rhythm with matches. I think I'm fascinated with that number.
1, 2, 3, 4. Drum boogie, drum boogie, da-da-da-da-da. Drum boogie, drum boogie, drum boogie, drum boogie, drum boogie.
And that is one of my favorite scenes from the movie. But coming back to the fairy tale subject, this movie is clearly based on the original Snow White folk tale, but also is a spin too on the Disney's adaptation. And much like both stories, there's a woman who's escaping the law and finds herself in the need to be hidden. In this case, it's in the house of a group of men who are writing an encyclopedia, and there are 8 men, 7, like pretty much the 7 dwarfs, and there's an 8th man who's Gary Cooper, who in this case plays the role of the prince sometime and of Snow White in some instances, I'd say too. And the 7 dwarfs, the 7 older professors, they're pretty much like again in the Disney's version. They're old men but with a very childish attitude. In this case, the evil stepmother is played by Dana Andrews. Again, as in many Billy Wilder films, the roles are more often than not inverted and played around and poked fun at, and that's what happens here. Dana Andrews plays the bad guy, the evil queen in this case, and as we find out, the lady in distress in this case is not as fair and as square as the original version would be, and that's something that, again, it's very present in Billy Wilder's spin around classic fairy tales. It is an opportunity to expand the impact of those stories and transform them into romantic comedies. And I believe, like in the previous example, it's the influence of fairy tales and the work that Billy Wilder did that really shaped, I think, the romantic comedy in its contemporary form, and that's the way we've been enjoying fairy tales, again, in a contemporary way, as pretty much romantic comedies. In this case, with a very witty and intelligent plot. It hasn't been the case in many instances, but I think that this way of doing it is pretty great. And it is a wonderful film in my opinion. I think it needs to be enjoyed a lot more. Alright, the second fairy tale that we will discuss is The Little Red Riding Hood. And in this case, this is again a personal interpretation of the movie, and that is The Major and the Minor, the first movie that Billy Wilder wrote and directed. And although Wilder later described this movie as a version of Lolita, to me it is a very loose interpretation or comedic spin to The Little Red Riding Hood fairy tale. Again, it's a personal interpretation, but I find many similarities between The Little Red Riding Hood and this movie. If you watch the trailer for this movie, it is treated pretty much as if it were a fairy tale in any case.
Once upon a time, there was a very, very good little girl who went a-riding on a train for half fare. Now, the big bad conductor wasn't so sure she was so very, very little.
And in the original story, it is about a little girl whose grandmother has made a red cap that she wears, and she's sent by her mother to her grandmother's house because the grandmother is ill. She's bringing her food, and on her way to her grandmother's house through the forest, she encounters a wolf. And it was meant to be, way back when, a cautionary tale in a way that don't talk to strangers, don't stray from the path. And in The Major and the Minor, which is again a film that I really, really love, we found Susan Applegate, who's a woman from a small town who goes to New York and finds herself going from work to work until she finds a wolf in the form of actor Robert Benchley, who was incidentally the grandfather of author Peter Benchley, who wrote Jaws. And she's doing him a scalp treatment, a scalp massage, and he's way over the line. And she's so fed up with the whole New York thing, and she just wants to go back to Iowa. She's a redhead, keep that in mind, and she has saved money for the fare to go back home, but when she goes and tries to buy the ticket, she finds out that it's more expensive than she initially thought it would be, and her idea is to buy a children's fare because it's cheaper and to pass as a 12-year-old girl. Even though you're like, really? Can't they tell? But again, somehow Wilder could overcome all this incredibly crazy plots and through wit and humor really make them work, which is amazing. In this case, it is a brilliant way to make something really insane work and turning it into a really delightful romantic comedy. And it is especially funny here, the scenes with Ray Milland when they meet, full of double meanings.
Call me Uncle Philip.
Double meanings. A lot of,
you have a lady with you?
Dozens of undertones, like pretty much the Little Red
Yes,
Riding
Uncle
Hood
Philip.
story.
Then suppose you go in there and get
filled with undertones too, and somehow they make it work. Ray Milland and Ginger Rogers are absolutely brilliant. And there's also a line in the film that I think alludes to The Little Red Riding Hood. She says, "My mother."
You're very kind, but well, my mother told me that. Well, you see, you are a strange gentleman.
Yes, well, we can soon fix that.
Of The Little Red Riding Hood, we even have the grandmother at the end of the movie, which is pretty much Ginger Rogers dressed up as her own grandmother. And he alludes to that little red hair of yours.
There's a sort of glow to your hair. I was watching you in the mess hall this afternoon.
Were you?
Yes, that little red head of yours is like a dandelion in a big meadow of uniforms.
Again, I think that it might be a far-fetched interpretation, but I think it's not. I find some very similar motives and innuendo and undertones in both Little Red Riding Hood and The Major and the Minor, which only makes me love this film even more. Alright, and the last fairy tale that we will discuss in relation to the films of Billy Wilder is Cinderella, which has become far more than just a fairy tale. It has become a true archetype on its own, and specifically in romantic movies. A really, really omnipresent figure and, again, archetype that it's been used many times in romantic movies. It is certainly one of the most popular and ancient story, which has its origins in many cultures. From what I've read, it has been popularized again, of course, by Disney, and in Billy Wilder's case, and that's why I tend to save the best for last. In Billy Wilder's case, the Cinderella story or plot, it's one that you can find more evidently in many of his films. It's either mentioned, alluded to, or directly used as an inspiration to make a comedy from. In this case, with this particular fairy tale, we will talk about 3 movies that are influenced by this very popular story, and these films are Midnight, Sabrina, and Some Like It Hot, even though we could even, I think, find even more examples, but for the purposes of this video, we'll just talk briefly about Midnight, Sabrina, and Some Like It Hot. The first one, Midnight, is one of my favorite comedies from that era, and it is in this case a script by Billy Wilder and Charles Brackett. It was directed by Mitchell Leeson, much to the wrath and the rage of Billy Wilder, who considered that he tended to too often make changes to the original script, and that is something that eventually prompted Wilder into directing, because aside from Lubitsch, he didn't want anyone to just manipulate his scripts. But in this case, in my opinion, the film is really beautiful. It really works.
Once upon a time, you remember, there was a girl named Cinderella. She had a fairy godmother, a pumpkin coach, a glass slipper, and a Prince Charming. But she had to leave her party at midnight. Now we'd like you to meet a modern, streamlined Cinderella, whose party begins where the other left off, at midnight. Her name also starts with a C, Claudette Colbert.
I love the story and I love the movie, to be honest. It stars Claudette Colbert. I think she is brilliant here, and also Dawn Amici, who is wonderful too, and John Barrymore, who is hilarious here and wonderful, and Mary Astor too, who is absolutely brilliant, I think, in everything she does. In this case, again, also a fairy tale. It's the excuse to create a screwball comedy and a farce with people pretending to be who they're not, with really Daffy and Zanny situations. The title of Midnight derives from the phrase that every Cinderella has her midnight. In this case, the Cinderella is Claudette, who is, let's face it, a gold digger. Meg Ryan in When Harry Met Sally says that women are very practical, and that's why Ingrid Bergman never stayed with Rick in Casablanca. She is a very practical woman who thinks that money is the recipe for stability, and she meets Dawn Amici, who's a cab driver and who's very much pulled by her views on life and her views on marriage and love, but they instantly fall for each other, and that causes a problem, obviously, for her aspirations. And then the very, very hilarious plot unravels, which I won't go into it because you must watch it. It's so wickedly funny and so full of one-liners.
Listen, if you want peace of mind, get yourself a taxi cab.
And there are several references to fairy tales in this one. And again, Claudette Colbert is so brilliant, and her scenes with John Barrymore, who plays sort of like the fairy godmother here, are the funniest, I think, of all. They are fantastic together. And I think that's why this movie truly works and why it's such a brilliant twist on the whole Cinderella idea. On to the next film, on to Sabrina. This is too also a movie that is clearly inspired by the whole Cinderella story, which is what pretty much the original tale has been reduced to. Is sort of like an unlikely romance between normally a woman who is of an inferior class or upbringing and then a more wealthy or successful man, and that's something that we've seen many times in romantic comedies, and this movie is a clear example. In this case, Billy Wilder directed this film too, and he adapted the play Sabrina Fair, and in this case we find that Sabrina is the daughter of the British chauffeur played by John Williams, and Sabrina brilliantly played by Audrey Hepburn, and who works for the Larrabee family, the industrialists that have two sons, David and Linus, and Sabrina has always been in love with David, played by William Holden, and then she goes to Paris where she studies cooking and she comes transformed. It's a whole makeover like we also have seen many times later on in romantic comedies, but it's also the makeover that Cinderella herself has within the original story, and that's what happens here. She arrives transformed, and then we pretty much all know what happens after that. And in this case, we don't find as many reversal of roles. It's more a case of Sabrina finding her own identity, and that's something that's really relevant within the film, and that is why the film has become also too very inspirational for many comedies, romantic comedies afterwards. And the last movie that we will review or talk about from the Cinderella point of view in Billy Wilder's movies is Some Like It Hot, which is a movie that, as I mentioned before in other videos, is one of my favorites. And there's a moment in the film where the character played by Jack Lemmon, Daphne, or Jerry, but more specifically Daphne, refers to herself as Cinderella II, and it seems like a casual, very funny joke in the film, but if you kind of think a little deep about the relationship of Daphne and Osgood, there is definitely an allusion there to Cinderella, and I think in this case Jack Lemmon genuinely serves as a comedic twist to the whole Cinderella story, and I think in this case it is a clear example of roles being reversed and playing around with sexual innuendo again, and playing around with identity and what we consider our identity and what defines us and the gender roles. It's a clear example of all that, and several motives of Cinderella are used in Some Like It Hot, specifically again with Jack Lemmon and Daphne. The shoe that fits the shoe, that's the whole initiation of the Cinderella II joke. And then they have the ball, and how he is convinced that no matter what, Daphne, Jerry, Jack Lemmon is the one for him. I think it is a brilliant, again, use of a common motif that audiences would pick up on and give it another twist, give it another meaning. It's up to us in any case to interpret what happens, and I think that's what makes his movies so amazing. That's what engages us so much as an audience, and I think that's why I love his movies so much. And that's it then for today's video. I really hope that you enjoyed, as always, this kind of videos. Really hope that you are wanting to watch these movies all over again or discover them if you haven't already. Thank you so much for watching. Stay safe. Let's keep sharing what we love, and we'll see each other in my next video. Bye!